So your stay in Cape Town, how has it been?
It's been very interesting. Well, this is not my first time.
Yes.
This is my third Cape Town conversation. So from the first 2023, 24, it's always interesting coming to Cape Town.
Yeah.
It's different from Joburg. It's not as authentic as Joburg, but it has its own vibe, as our youngsters will put it.
Yes.
So he has his own touristy vibe.
Touristy vibe. and
Unfortunately, I've spent the last 3 days holed up in one venue.
Very, very compact program.
Very, very compact.
The Cape Town Conversation. But maybe because it comes out as a consequence of G20.
No, the timing was amazing. It was perfect because it then enables us to ask the proper question after G20 presidency of South Africa that has come out with these progressive declaration. What next? How do we make this the G20 of the people? By reflecting on all those issues that were captured in that 30-page document about ownership, Africa's having a seat at the table, which South Africa has demonstrated by ensuring that you have all these players from all parts of the world present here in spite of, rather than because of, and still managing to come out with a consensus document that speaks to the issues that are concerned to the average African about security, about development, about critical minerals, about sustainable development goals, about domestic resource mobilization, about illicit financial flows, about energy security, about energy poverty, about climate action. All of those issues are there. The challenge for us now is, now that we have done the analysis and we've identified the issues, there's nothing really new in the document. These are things that have come out of previous documents. It's like we are reinforcing or reasserting decisions that we've already taken as Africans and the globe. But reinforcing it in a manner that has never really been done by Africans being at the table, not on the menu. We've always been on the menu.
Yes. And now we are also cooking.
We're now partly cooking. We're not yet cooking. We're in the kitchen. We've not been allowed to become the chef. But we're in the kitchen with them, watching how the chef is putting the items together, the culinary skills that we need. We're beginning to identify it and discovering that actually we have the skills. We've just not been given the opportunity for our own autonomous action to complement what others are doing. And what I think the current changing, evolving global order does, if we take advantage properly, is the opportunity for that autonomous space as Africans to define in a manner that is most responsive to the yearnings of our population, mostly young people. How to do development with our people, not doing development to our people. I think that's really the challenge we face, because it's like we've been treated for so long as if we have no agency. Yet the young people of Africa, they know what they want. They know what they would like to see, whether you define it as jobs and employment or the good life or money, whatever it is. You cannot have a seat at the table as a leader or you ought not to have a seat at the table as a leader if you don't have a seat to mobilize the hearts and minds of your general population.
Let's get this problem of Africa and what seems to be a global reorganization, a global order that is changing. So the theme as well today about a just global order.
Just global order.
But Africa is seemingly faced up with the changing balance of forces.
Absolutely.
In what one could describe as its most, or one of its most weakest positions.
Yes.
As a collective continental force. And you are saying that you could take advantage of the fact that, you know, the United States no longer calls the shots as a unipolar police force
Of the world.
that there are these new
Multiple
emerging
centers of
powers.
powers.
Yes, but isn't it true that there was a time when something like this occurred, and it found the continent perhaps at the time in a much weaker position, that some may characterize this disorganized, weaker Africa as again coming into that space to be subjected to yet another scramble?
Historically, yes. You would recall that 80 years ago, the post-Second World War order
Yes.
that we're now exiting, so to speak, did not have Africa on the table. As a matter of fact, maybe it had 4 African states: Liberia, Ethiopia, Haiti, if you want to add global Africa to it, and South Africa in its earlier apartheid form, not in the majoritarian South African state. Those were the 4 that were at the table when the Charter of the United Nations came into being 80 years ago. Not the 54 African countries, independence, call it flag independence, but at least self-ruled,
Yes.
that we have now. And the focus then, even for the 4, which aligned with the resistance of our own black brethren inside America, the civil rights movement, was the Pan-African decolonization project. In the immediate aftermath of that, which was the early 60s, when the bulk of our countries had become independent, the focus then was, how do we achieve this in all of our countries? We cannot be free if some of us are still in shackles of colonialism, imperialism, oppression. And the work of the Organization of African Unity in its early days was decolonization and anti-apartheid. Eventually, we succeeded in that work. And at moments where we have such social gains, it was also because we had purposeful leadership and a Pan-Africanist vision aligned to drive the agenda for development and change. Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Sekou Touré, the drivers of that earlier Pan-Africanist movement for change, were able to pull all of their colleagues together and pull the citizenry of Africa in that direction.
Yes.
And that continued for the greater part of the first 2 decades of Africa's independence. In fact, let's say 3 decades till 94, when the last freedom song was unfold here in South Africa.
Yes.
So first 3 decades was an anti-colonial struggle. And then the next time that we had to fight that kind of battle with gains that were evident to us, because as we were fighting the decolonization battle, we were also struggling for democratization. Because the bulk of our people were under dictatorships of various kinds. Military, one-party state, authoritarian.
And rogue states.
And rogue states, yes. But in that period, the battle for democratization also coincided with the collapse of the Cold War. The collapse of the Soviet state. And in the first decade of that post-Cold War era, the democratization, first decade of, so to speak, democratization, the leadership on the continent was also driven, interestingly, by another set of purposeful Pan-African visionaries that developed the New Partnership for Africa's Development, which you could argue was the sequel to the Lagos Plan of Action that was developed by that first generation leadership in the 80s, which was a comprehensive plan. But some of the people who subscribed to the Lagos Plan of Action, driven largely by our planning ministers, were the authoritarian products of that era who signed up to it more of half-heartedly and did not quite pursue it. But that was not the case with the Mbekis and the Obasanjos and the Abdoulaye Wade and the Bouteflika of the New Partnership for Africa's Development, who were really determined that Africa must rise again and that we have the tools, we have the capacity, if we can dedicate ourselves and also respect our people's wish for freedom, for democratic development, for accountable governance. But we also saw the result of that in how they managed to intervene in questions of security, stability, peacekeeping, all of the things that used to be done by outsiders. We took on the mantle. In ECOWAS, Nigeria was at the forefront of resolving the crisis in Sierra Leone, resolving the crisis in Liberia, resolving the crisis in Côte d'Ivoire. And down south, the new South Africa had taken on the mantle of leadership to intervene in DRC.
Yes.
And manage to stem the tide of conflict there. Nigeria and some other African countries had played the critical role in the United Nations to drive human rights in Rwanda, to stem the tide of genocide there, when people are still quibbling over what to call it. But now, if you like, another 30 years after, that was in the 90s that we were talking about, 90s, 2000, 30, 25 years after, we're grappling because it would appear as if we've put the cart before the horse. We've achieved all these documents. We've produced all these protocols. But we seem to have been consumed more by the processes of democratization, electoralism, rather than the outcomes, which is tangible economic transformation for our people. So we have still not tackled the drivers of the structural drivers of instability and insecurity, which in my humble opinion would rest squarely on the shoulders of poverty and inequality. Even at the time that we have gone into electoralism, cycles of election every 4 years or every 5 years, that has not produced tangible, concrete benefit for our people.
I want to come back to the actual internal problem about Africa and a sustained effort in the production of a specific ethic of leadership. But just to sort of conclude the cycle of Africa's relations with the superpowers, this month in particular has been very momentous, as it were, because what we've also seen is not just the United States' attitude towards South Africa, its program to sabotage the G20 with the sole purpose of humiliating South Africa. But interestingly, Nigeria is a new target of Mr. Trump's administration, with an assertion that there is a killing of Christians. If Nigeria doesn't get that act together, there'll be an intervention. Christians can be killed. I mean, in this case, he's intervening not for whites, like he is, or seemingly he's thinking he is. In the case of South Africa, it's another sort of identity, important Western identity called Christianity or Christians. This target of Nigeria, how would you make it make sense for us? What is at stake there?
Frankly, it seems to me interesting that at the same time that South Africa was being attacked for white genocide, so-called, Nigeria is confronting the stigma of Christian genocide. And as much as we may quibble over whether there is Christian genocide in Nigeria or white genocide, I think there is a much deeper issue that we must look at. Clearly, there are killings in Nigeria, unacceptable level of killings of innocent people. Let's put aside the faith to which they subscribe or do not subscribe. Why that should happen should concern the Nigerian state and those in charge of the Nigerian state, that they ought to do something effective to stem the tide of insurgency and mindless orgy of violence responsible for that. I think there should be a general agreement about that. Leaving that aside, I don't subscribe to the notion that there's any Christian genocide in Nigeria because, first, the violence that has been prevalent in Nigeria over the last, more than a decade now, since about 2009, when the scourge of Boko Haram started, has been indiscriminate.
It has not really focused on whether a person's identity or religion. And we know this because the bigger sort of international incident related to actually the kidnap of Muslim girls.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. And you can see it even in the most recent instances that we've had over the last week or two. We've had Muslim students, girls being abducted. We've had innocent people worshiping in a church being abducted. And that is the scenario across the board. The question that we must put to ourselves, and that's the point I was making earlier, about whether it is ethnic dissension, whether it is gender discrimination, whether it's religious violence, these are symptomatic of a deeper crisis of failure of governance, in my view. And unless we tackle the roots of structural violence,
What are they? Nigeria is the largest population base of the African continent.
Correct.
And in this new era that you are describing, it was recovering from multiple coup d'etats,
Dictatorships,
dictatorships, which were at the center, military dictatorships.
Absolutely.
So you're suggesting that there is a problem of structural incapacity to govern the entire population, that the state doesn't reach. Unpack that for us. What is the structural problem?
Okay, well, in every part of the world, nation building is a continuous process. It's an unfinished business. But at least what you like to see is progressive nation building, not regressive nation building. But Nigeria has suffered over decades from that unfinished nation building process, resolving the national question, which of course has at its roots ethnicity, religious differences, but much more importantly, inequality of all types. And anywhere you have extremes of poverty lying astride extremes of wealth, what tends to result from such a combination is conflict. Because those who are the have-nots have a legitimate interest in making their lives better. And whether it manifests itself in religion or ethnicity, as we have seen in Nigeria now, it's just a vehicle for attaining relevance, vehicle for voices to be heard, vehicles for accountability, and vehicles for dealing with what is perceived as dissonance in the governance framework. And what societies tend to do about that, as you've had to do even here in the CODESA discussions that led to the constitutional making process in South Africa, was to ensure that you manage difference. Society is not always monolithic. And when you have diversity, there must be a way to manage diversity and difference. Nigeria has not successfully managed this diversity and difference in a manner that would result in democratic development that is substantially felt by the larger majority of the populace. And that's what we see, whether you call it Boko Haram or you call it Islamic State. And of course, there are externalities that feed on this unfinished nation building process. We've seen that in some of the extremities that manifest through religion or through ethnicity, and the external influences that come with what might be described as colonial, post-colonial, imperialist forces. But if the state is determined and its people are determined, and those who are in charge use the resources of the state to improve the quality of life of the citizens, the likelihood of this kind of mindless violence that we're witnessing will be significantly reduced. And that's why I said that unless we deal with the structural roots, which in my view still revolve around poverty and inequality, we won't be able to address all these other issues that are just fallouts.
How do we circle then Trump's interest in this problem? You call it the national question problem in Nigeria. What suddenly draws, if it has been, a problem that has been there more or less, whose name the world understand it, in this instance as Boko Haram. But how do you help us make sense of United States now direct sudden interest?
Well, Honestly, it's, I mean, one could analyze, but you can't really pinpoint that this is the primary cause of what has transpired. But it's obvious to those who have monitored what is going on in the United States that President Trump has its base, the popular base for his support. And there is a Christian constituency in that base that is part of that base. The sense that I get is that that Christian constituency has managed to reach the policy portals within the Trump administration and also gained access to voices that are respected by
Mr. Trump.
That clearly is the case. And Nigeria has not done enough as a state to counter that narrative. Partly because the structures of governance have not been fully put in place to activate a response mechanism. We don't have an ambassador in 2.5 years in the United States. We don't monitor actively what goes on in Congress in the United States, where these conversations are taking place. We don't have a very active lobbying vehicle. I mean, as you know, in America, lobbyists are very important and they play a critical role in policy formulation and implementation, even though behind the scene. And I'm not so sure that even when the structures of the State Department have put in place information about this sort of narrative, the Nigerian state has played a role to counter it, because these are annual reports that are written on religious extremism, on attacks on churches. There's an international report that comes out of State Department on an annual basis that documents attacks on churches, attacks on individual Christians, and which then collectively form the impression that we have seen. The extent to which the Nigerian state has managed to respond to this as effectively as it ought to is clearly not something that one can say has been done. And that has fed into the narrative. And there's no question that you also have some Nigerians who are agitating on their own level. If you take the so-called Biafrans, they have a lobbyist in the United States that constantly feed the structures of governance there with information to perpetuate the myth or the view that they are also victims of oppression and genocide, so-called.
Yes.
As Christians. Because they're predominantly Christians. This is why this is happening to us. And we haven't succeeded as a state to counter that narrative as effectively as we ought to. I think that's what has gotten to Mr. Trump. And there are, of course, other factors that may have come into play. I mean, we know what is happening in the Sahel. America is very, very worried, understandably, about anything that remotely smacks of proliferation of terrorism. But if you're going to be sensitive to that, you ought to be sensitive to it holistically, not just selectively, because it also ought to be clear to anybody who has studied this situation that the crisis in Libya has been somewhat responsible for the proliferation of weapons and the training of some of the terrorists who have now found their way into Nigeria to perpetrate this crisis. And the crisis in the Sahel.
And Libya is a creation
of America's policy. You get my point. So, and what is going on in the Sahel is not just failure of governance on the part of those states, but failure of intervention on the part of the Western powers. And of course, that has now triggered multiple interventions in that axis by Gulf states, by Russia, by Korea, by Turkey. All of them are players on the field in the Sahel to the detriment of the population.
Yes. Yes.
Even if it is in propping up the various military governments that exist in those states now.
Let's come back then to the earlier question of the continent's capacity to pull together in this era. I mean, you've got this multipolarity, and you were describing post-World War II really is the era of Soviet-US contestation.
Absolutely.
But it is true that about 50 years before that or so, European superpowers set and cut Africa for themselves.
Yes, scramble.
And the risk that is being described that we might be facing now because of this disorganization you've just described is that the superpowers, which are mineral hungry, looking for these African mineral resources in the development of latest technologies in artificial intelligence, technologies, and yes, in your electric vehicles, but in that particular, they are not going to wait for Africans to be organized.
No, they're not.
And they've got to get that development going. They are going to do something. And they might have to meet somewhere that, okay, if I claim the DRC for myself, I claim the Sahel for myself, I claim for, this is my region, you get in, we go to war, whatever the case might be. This situation of Africa's inability to pull together, what do you bring it down to? I mean, how come we couldn't reproduce this set of leaders you are speaking about, from Obasanjo to Thabo Mbeki, which, as you say, had been a struggle even before because a set of generation existed to lead decolonization.
Yeah.
Why has Africa not managed to reproduce itself in terms of a leadership whose only interest is to act in the collective well-being and development of its people?
I think there are a number of factors that one could trace that to. Without sounding complacent, we're still relatively young as countries. But what has been defective, in my view...
Younger than China? I mean,
oh, yes.
Ghana is older than China.
Well, you could argue, yes, if you want to trace it back.
Haiti is older than the global South as we know it.
Correct. That's why I said
it's even older than some of the European states,
absolutely.
To the extent to which the industrial revolutions and democratization movements of Europe themselves are concerned. Haiti is one of the first, republics.
Yeah. No, there's no question about that. Mm-hmm. What I was driving at is, as states, relatively speaking, they're younger. Not as empires.
Agreed. Agreed.
And we're still dealing with the Westphalian notion of state development now. However, I think to your question, there's something that has become defective about our leadership recruitment process. Because that generation that we talked about, there was audacity to be autonomous on behalf of the people. When even military leaders, Muammar Gaddafi, in his green paper, Murtala Mohammed in Nigeria, when he gave the speech in 1975, damning Henry Kissinger and co. about Africa has come of age, and you will not decide for us how to drive development in our continent. How old were they? Just to flip it back to your point, they were young leaders, but they were audacious, they were driven, they were purposeful, and they were Pan-Africanist. a lot of what we have ended up with in the so-called search for democratic legitimacy, which I refer to, frankly, in my view, as electoralism, because in it, this liberal democratic order that we are all pursuing now seems to focus more on processes
than the quality of
outcomes that can then bring transformational economic structures in place for the benefit of our people.
What do we do? What must change?
Well,
what do we do differently?
What we have to do differently, we have to return to brass tacks. These conversations that we're having cannot just be a conversations of power. They must also be conversations of values and principles. And whilst it is tempting, just as you've said, to slice Africa up and share it amongst themselves, and talking about metropolitan powers now. And it is tempting on our part to remain fragmented, uncoordinated, because we think we can do a deal, DRC with America on our critical minerals, or Nigeria with China. There is no alternative to pushing for a united agenda. The notion that we all get invited to China and 54 African heads of state run to China, or we get invited to United States, we carry our bags, we all go to United States. It might look as if we're attractive, that's why they're inviting us to all these, UAE Africa, China Africa, we go to FOCAC, or United States Africa meeting. Yes, it might be a way of demonstrating that we're relevant. But what do we do when we go there? We're not singing from the same hymn sheet. We don't have a pre-meeting amongst ourselves before we go for such meetings. We're busy scrambling for crumbs from the table of these people. Instead of saying, hey, China, you want to engage with us? Come to Addis Ababa. Or, okay, we've all decided amongst ourselves that we're having the meeting in Johannesburg. We'll meet you in Johannesburg. And we decide, those of us who are the owners of the critical minerals, 70% of cobalt is in Africa. 90% of platinum is right here. Manganese, 75%. Half of the gold in the world reserve is with us. We have decided, all the countries who have these resources, Guinea alone controls a quarter of the bauxite resources in the world in Simandu project alone. And we've decided that, look, just as we did in the era of OPEC, we will control pricing, we will insist on local beneficiation, we would do joint exploration with you, but everything, you want to set up that lithium plant for your EV battery, you set it up in DRC. Or we've decided amongst ourselves that that plant will be in South Africa because electricity, for other factors, will make it better. So we would have resolved that amongst ourselves before we go for such engagement. That way, capital will know that we have thought through our issues. We also have capacity for domestic resource mobilization. President Mbeki did a report in 2012 on illicit financial flows in Africa. If you look at the declaration that has just been released by the G20 presidents, the leaders' declaration, it states there, one of the paragraphs talks about $88 billion annually leaving Africa through illicit financial flows. So we are rich, but we're not even aware of how rich we are. And we don't put this on the table to negotiate. Also, our other values are not captured. Our forests, we're talking climate change, climate justice. And some people come to us and say, okay, all the oil you have to shut it down because it is fossil fuel. Meanwhile, half of our population, 600 million of our people, don't have access to electricity.
Yeah, they're still using wood to cook. Yes. So what are they transitioning from?
Thank you very much. So we ought to be able to put on the table, as some of the African leaders in fairness have done at the COP meetings, to put on the table that energy poverty is a real issue for us. Because if we solve energy poverty, there is a multiplier effect of that in developmental terms that we cannot ignore. I mean, at a time that they're talking about, what's that thing they're always saying now? About data centers that is consuming all this power. We just want to be able to have electricity for our children to cook, to go to school, warm water, to read their book.
Yes, for lights and...
So these are the kind of conversations that will necessitate us coming together. Rather than, because if we go into these negotiations as Nigeria versus United States, South Africa, China, they will eat us up for lunch. And the scramble will continue unchecked. We need to return to that Pan-Africanist ideal of collective, integrated response to whatever is coming out. But to do that, we also need to capacitate those we put in charge of those institutions. We're talking about free trade area, a 3 trillion economy, the largest single market in the world, with the largest population.
And young,
energetic. And yet, it's largely on paper. There is none of these things that we have not done. Africans have always had the notion of Ubuntu, collective security, collective development. Without you, I don't exist. Nothing ought to stop us from putting all those machineries that are in place, whether you talk of the African peace and security architecture, or you talk of the continental free trade area, or you talk of the common principles on labor and migration and development. In all of these areas, we have developed protocols, we've developed mechanisms, we've developed specific ideas that ought now to be taken to the next level of implementation. But that's not happening because we're so consumed by what is coming to us, not what is coming to the collective and to the greater good of our people. And if we don't respond quickly enough, we're all going to be consumed by this.
The Sahel is looking at different forms of uprisings. We've seen all of them, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, but there's also been different forms of agitation, collective mass agitation in Kenya, in Tanzania, Mozambique, and recently Madagascar. Could the recent movement against different states in the continent, when you look at these movements, is there a prospect of the emergence of a Pan-African agenda? Are people who understand what you're saying, that there's no capacity
individually,
there's no way you are going to get the development of South Africa correctly without at the same time thinking and acting in the world in the interest of the development of the continent? When you look at these developments, is there a sign of an emerging African collective leadership different to the one that has been leading Africa in the last 15, maybe 20 years?
I think nature abhors a vacuum. And clearly, it is beginning to come up. I mean, just the way that we saw African leaders take the apartheid as a collective assault and insult. And you had a state like Nigeria being treated as a frontline state in Southern Africa because of its contribution. In Angola, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa. And it's way 5,000 kilometers away from the front line. But no, you had that commitment that was Pan-African, that was ideological, that was clear-sighted about we all cannot be free unless all of us are free. Now, the intellectual argument is there. The competence is there amongst our people. Because when you look at it, in these so-called Western capitals, our citizens are the ones doing wonderfully well. So, capacity, competence, compassion, intellectual agility, integrity, we have it. But do we have the courage to confront this monster, be they in presidential palaces or in any other part of our evolving states? That even when the evil is amongst us, we will confront the evil and not let outsiders do it for us. That's the question you're asking. And I think increasingly it's inevitable because when you have, as I said earlier, extremes of poverty lying astride inexplicable wealth at the top 1% of the population, and the 99% of the population is hopeless and helpless, there's bound to be an immovable rock being confronted by an unstoppable force.
Yes.
And that force would overcome. The best we can do is to find a way to direct it in a manner that it achieves that objective without causing maximum chaos.
Maximum chaos. You were a governor as well as a minister
Yes.
in Nigeria. And interestingly, as a minister, you were dealing with
Mining.
questions of mining.
Yes.
But there's been very interesting industrial developments with the oil refinery
Yes.
in Nigeria. How does that, in your determination, change the industrial fortunes, maybe of the region?
Well, you know, frankly, I think it's a game changer. It's a significant game changer. I dealt as Minister of Mines, I dealt with Mr. Aliko Dangote a lot because some of the minerals he was dealing with in his own industry before he moved into hydrocarbons were under my purview. Limestone,
Yes.
cement, and all those things.
Yes.
I mean, was something. So I had, and this was at a time that Nigeria was importing, and he has managed to lead the complete reversal of that. We've become a net exporter of cement from a net importer of cement. I mean, and singularly through his efforts of President Obasanjo and policies driven largely to promote import substitution and at the same time support industrial development. And I think this is what he has now elevated to what he has done in the field of refining. And when he finished what he was doing in Nigeria on mining in the cement sector, he then moved to other African countries. I mean, I've been with him to commission projects in Congo, Brazzaville, in Ndola, in Zambia. I was there with him in Ethiopia when he's built cement factories in all these places that are thriving, that are producing and supplying industrial minerals for local development. And specifically on the question you have asked, he has managed to also begin to reverse the trend. Nigeria has been in net, even it's unfortunate and it's part of the crisis of weak governance that we're talking about. Nigeria is one of the largest reserves of oil in Africa. And we used to have refineries to produce, but all those refineries went pear-shaped. So we were importing refined products. A country that produces crude, it's like lithium or cobalt that we're talking about. So platinum. Yeah. So you send your platinum, instead of beneficiating it locally, you send it out. And then by the time it's coming back to you, you are buying it at a price that is unaffordable because it's far more expensive than what you sold the raw materials for. That's the situation Nigeria has found itself in the last 2 decades, pretty much. So Aliko Dangote has managed to reverse that. But what that speaks to is also that the capital we need for this overall comprehensive development will not come from government alone, no matter how well-meaning our governments are. It should come from our partners, but not out of paternalism or pity.
Yes.
But out of genuine partnership. That we have this, you are bringing your expertise, how do we bring the forces together? And he's managed to build the world's largest refinery, which is not just with the capacity to supply refined products for Nigeria, but also for the rest. It's a Pan-Africanist project as far as I'm concerned. It's not a Nigerian project. It's not an individual project. It's a Pan-Africanist project. And I'm also glad that Aliko Dangote is a Pan-Africanist. I know he's involved with a number of other, rich people on the continent in an African Renaissance project that he has set up. He's chair of the club, and they bring in some of the more progressive leaders on the continent, President Obasanjo, President Mbeki, President Kagame, to interact with them. The kinds of contributions they can make to deepen their engagement as entrepreneurs. To reflect on how they can assist and work with governments in building enduring, longer-lasting partnership for transformation on the continent, to address those structural issues I talked about, because they cannot be comfortable themselves with all of their billions if majority of us are still wallowing in poverty. So it is in their interest to support concrete development on the continent. And we ought to commend them for what they're doing and also support them with the right policies. Because we cannot have, as Aliko Dangote has said many times, you cannot have a continental free trade area where the entrepreneurs cannot travel freely.
Instead, you've got a lot of gangsters that are traveling, and
so you get 54
human traffickers.
Even when you have addressed this through technology, say artificial intelligence, artificial intelligence should be a product of inclusion rather than exclusion.
Yes.
And it's not going to replace the workers. It would enable the work. It should be an enabler for productivity, not a replacement. Yes, there are many things happening in that regard. There's a Pan-African payment system that has been worked on by the African Bank. There are a number of other things that our tech entrepreneurs are doing. M-Pesa in Nairobi, Flutterwave in Nigeria, several other tech companies in South Africa. And we are becoming exemplars in mobile money provision to the world now. But that in and of itself will not rescue us from arrested development. Government needs to play its part much more actively. Government can only do that if we have the kind of leaders that are drivers of change, not leaders that just want to continue to egregiously subvert the will of their people, as we have just seen in Tanzania. It's a shit show, if you don't mind my French. And that
I think it's quite pretty direct Nigerian.
I mean, we can't have that in the land of Julius Nyerere.
Yes.
He was one of those I just talked about in the Nkrumah era. And now here we are. So what is this democracy if it doesn't serve the people?
Doc, thank you so much. Maybe you'll help us get the Pan-Africanist and leader of African Renaissance and industrialization to the show next time, Mr. Tamote. I hope.
I would be very glad to talk to him about it and to ask him to engage with you.
We'll come wherever he is. We'll come. It will be nice to actually go travel and hold the conversation in one of his
at the refinery.
Factories.
No, you should go to the refinery and have
to the refinery.
This Pan-Africanism should not just be the Pan-Africanism of politicians. It should be Pan-Africanism of exemplars in all fields. Enterprise, academy, politics, industry. We need to grow it in a way that is not just on paper, written up in the archives of the African Union in Addis Ababa and the regional communities, but actively pursued by the leaders that we have invested with the authority to represent us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's it.